Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are. Welcome to this Interactive Services webinar on classroom training. My name is Damien DeBarra. I'll introduce myself properly in a minute. But while I've had you waiting here, I've left a slide up on screen here with one of my favorite quotes on the subject of learning from anybody ever. And it's obviously from Sir Winston Churchill. And he famously said, I believe in an address to Parliament, "Personally, I'm always ready to learn, although I do not always like being taught." And whilst it's a wonderful kind of back of a beer mat quote, which is great fun to quote at parties and things, it actually has a really serious point, which is it seems to me like a really wonderful summary of the attitude of most of the learners that we design classroom training for. They come to our classes, they are ready to learn, they wouldn't be there otherwise. Many of them really do care about it, but there seems to be fundamentally something wrong with the way in which most of us have had classroom training experiences. And I thought Churchill's quote summarized it beautifully. It's an idea which we'll come back to a couple of times through this webinar as we talk about classroom training. So just bear that in mind as we work our way through. So to quickly introduce myself and what this session is about, this is called the Many-to-Many Classroom. 3 simple steps to better classroom learning. In terms of myself, as I said, my name is Damien. I'm obviously from Dublin, Ireland, as you might be able to guess from the accent, although I'm talking to you today from London, England. I'm Interactive Services Head of Instructional Design, and I've been with the company just about 5 years. So what's today's session about? Well, really what I want to do is show you some examples of classroom learning work we've done as a company over the last 12, 18, 24 months, and extract out or focus in on 3 ideas which we try to apply to classroom training. And those 3 principles are, in really bald plain English: 1, make it interactive. Now, I know that sounds extraordinarily obvious, but I want to explore a little bit by what we mean by that word interactive. So it's probably one of the most overused or abused words in the world of learning. The second one is about aligning what you're doing to the brand. And I don't just mean pretty pictures and visuals. I'm talking about much more than that, really aligning to the voice of the client. And then the third part, and probably where I'll spend most of my time, I think, is talking about the third aspect, which is applying it to the job, extending the classroom, recognizing the simple fact that, as we often joke here at IS, learning isn't an event, it's a process. So let's dig into these one at a time. Before I move on, if anybody has any questions throughout the presentation, if you feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm going to leave us about 5 or 10 minutes towards the end for some Q&A. So the questions can be in any order you want or about anything you want. It can be as granular as you want or as large as you want. So feel free to type them into the chat box, and Neil will come back to us at the end and kind of summarize a few of those so we can have a bit of Q&A. Let's start with our first idea, making it interactive. So some of you will be familiar with the 80-20 rule or Pareto's principle, that idea that in any given body of work or endeavor, 20% of your activity will generate 80% of your success. So we see this in retail where, you know, 1 pair of trainers in a shoe shop will generate 80% of the revenue at that given time, or there's lots and lots of different versions of it. You've probably heard different versions. Our version of this is in recognition of the fact that classroom training often in the past, and many of you will have had these experiences, is often very one-to-many broadcast. And that idea of one-to-many broadcast comes from a guy called Clay Shirky, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Here Comes Everybody. And then he was arguing about the uprising power of social media. And he said we're moving to a many-to-many broadcast model. And I'll come back to that idea in a moment, but really what we're talking about here in terms of 80-20 is that a bad piece of classroom training, to be really blunt, would involve 80% facilitator talking and 20% of you, the learner, talking. Our suggestion is let's completely invert those numbers. Let's make it 20% facilitator and 80% learner talking. So let's dig into this a little bit more. So the idea in our classroom training all the time is we have to recognize the reality of what happens in classroom trainings. It's so easy to lose a learner within about 2 minutes by poorly designed slides, poorly designed activities, and fundamentally them not having a sense of why I'm here. So we say get them engaged and then keep them engaged. And I'll show you an example in a few minutes of what that might look like. We tell them why the learning is useful. Obvious, I know, but tell them why they're doing this. What are you going to get out of this? What's in it for me? How is it going to make me better on my job? What am I going to be able to do at the end of this classroom session that I couldn't do when I walked in? Give learners a simple framework of ideas that they can visually understand. The idea being, we want a learner to look at a slide, see a series of icons for a learner journey and go, I got it in one glance. And then, as I say, about this whole thing of, making it useful, give them tools they can use on the job. So what we want is to get them engaged, keep them engaged, and make them understand how it's going to benefit them in their job. Drilling down into it in a little bit more detail, going back to this Clay Shirky idea of the one-to-many broadcast model. If you could look back at the history of technology, the last 150 years, it was one-to-many. So the radio, one-to-many broadcast, TV, one-to-many broadcast, and so on and so forth. We're living in a many-to-many broadcast era, which is great because we've moved away from a model which really didn't reflect how people actually learn. And we're moving more towards a model that recognizes that people really do learn. And it's all based on the very simple observation that the most powerful tool for learning we have as human beings is conversation. So I would almost say, if you remembered nothing else I said today, remember this: make people talk to each other and learning will occur. It's not quite as simple as that, but if you include that in your classroom activities, it dramatically turbo boosts the retention of learning. So we call this the many-to-many classroom, the idea being that participants learn from each other. People come into classroom training, maybe it's day one hire, maybe it's sales training, whatever it is, they're not blank slates. They do have experiences in that industry, in that job, maybe to other companies. Let's get their voices heard. So everybody has a voice and is expected to use it. Lecture is used sparingly. Discussion and team activity should be maximized. We also want learners to lean in to learn. So participants are frequently asked to contribute and analyze. So they're kept on their toes at regular interaction and activities. There's no time to switch off. What we see sometimes in bad classroom training, let's say you're training in a call center and some poor guy's got to sit through 3-4 weeks of training. It's not uncommon after 3 hours of the 4th day that you see somebody sliding down their chair, doodling on a pad, they're switching off. It's human nature. You can burden them too much learning. So we've tried to come up with strategies to make them lean in. So listen to this person speaking about the 3 things you should never do in this situation. What did they say? They can't just be told that information. They're going to lean in to hear it. And then practice, practice, practice. Activity-based learning provides a safe space to practice new skills and explore concepts. And yes, learn from mistakes. Learning from mistakes is such a powerful agent in training. And I think sometimes in training, we get very nervous around the idea of people making mistakes. In actual fact, what we do is we try to build in spaces where it's perfectly safe to make mistakes and the learner knows that it's perfectly safe to make mistakes, because the real learning happens in the feedback. Recognize peak performance. Call out people in the classroom who are really doing it properly or who are pointing the way, and help them form best practice habits. And then make it stick. As I said already, it's a bit of a joke here at Interactive Services. We always say learning is not an event, it's a process. The class isn't complete until the learner has had a chance to demonstrate those new skills in the class, and then really, really crucially, shown that they have a plan to apply what's in the classroom to the job. So I'll come back to that in a little bit and show you some examples. So yeah, let's take a look at an example of a piece of classroom training. So I'm just going to jump slide deck here. So hopefully the screen doesn't go totally crazy, but still works. So this is a slide deck. It's done that thing. Hold on, I'm going to swap. This is a slide deck we put together about a year ago for a client of ours called Sitel. Sitel are a company who you may not have heard of, but whom you have very likely interacted with. So for example, if you have ever rung up Starbucks, you have a Starbucks loyalty card, and perhaps you've had cause to ring Starbucks or Tom's Shoes or a bunch of other companies who you might call for tech support, perhaps on your broadband, you're probably not talking to that company, you're actually talking to Sitel. They're a call center handler. And they're a fascinating business because obviously they answer the phones and handle calls and give tech support, and they have hundreds of thousands of agents who deal with this. But in addition to answering the phones, training is about 50% of their or any other call handler's business, because there's a huge churn and attrition in staff. It can be as high as 120%. It's extraordinary. That's kind of across the call center industry. So that's who it's for. Who's the audience? What's it about? New hire agents who are going to answer the phones to customers now receive a new form of training, which is based around this idea of think like a customer. The background is that 10, 12 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, when you rang a call center, you may have noticed they really tried to keep you on the phone. What else can I do to please you? What else can I do to make you happy? How can I, to borrow a phrase from Irish retail, from Fergal Quinn, how can I crown the customer? You know, did you know that people like you also buy these products? Would you be interested? There's been a realization of the obvious, I think, within that general industry, which is that's not what customers want. Why? Well, because if you're ringing a call center for support, whether it's about your coffee or whether it's about your broadband, you're probably not in a great mood ringing them anyway, because something's not working for you. So the new move is towards, let's resolve the customer's issues as quickly, efficiently, as professionally as we can and get them off the phone. Not because you don't want to deal with them, but because you know that they want to get off the phone. So this piece of training is a piece of classroom training to address that shift in thinking, to try and get them thinking like the customer. So I said earlier on, you know, get them engaged, keep them engaged. Let me show you an example or two of how we did that. Learning outcomes, nothing you need to dwell on there. Start out by talking about bad calls versus good calls. So what we did was we started out with a simple sort of media activity whereby the facilitator in the room, who has notes, by the way, telling them what to do, detailed step by step, starts out with playing an actual real phone call to the learners in the room. Now, you guys won't be able to hear it because it's just not going to broadcast through my screen, but you can see there if I roll over, there's a play button. And the facilitator's instructions are to press play and, if they want, walk out of the room. What follows is a very famous 8-minute phone call, which got leaked online a couple of years ago. It went viral. It was on boingboing.net, all those kind of things. It's an example of a gentleman who's recorded a phone call to a broadband provider, and he's ringing up to say, can you please cancel my account? The guy just won't let him off the phone. I defy any human being to sit through that entire 8 minutes without squirming in their seat or really, you know, you'll have a strong urge to run out of the room. It was deliberate. What we wanted was to provoke an emotional reaction in the learner, to make them think, even if subconsciously, I will never treat anyone like that on the phone. So you can see here, the activity is 15 minutes long. You can see the icon there. The icon here tells you it's a warm-up activity. We use a lot of icons and pictography to give you constant guidance to keep you engaged visually. Again, back to our guy who slid a bit down the seat. If he does snooze off and tunes back in, or maybe leaves the room, he can quickly glance and see, oh, I'm doing this activity. This is the amount of time. So they listen to the very painful phone call and then have a very spirited 5 to 6 minute discussion around these 3 questions. That then leads us into a sort of step by step. Okay, here's the facts. These are the things that drive customers away 4 times faster. That kind of robotic service, you get the general idea. Very, very common sense stuff. Now we go into another activity, 10 minutes, your experiences. Okay, learners in the room, get into pairs. John, talk to Sally. Sally, talk to John. Share your experiences of customer service. Tell us what was good. Tell us what was bad. How did that make you feel? Again, making them think like the customer. And now we have a follow-up activity, short one, crowdsource, which means every hand in the room goes up, every idea in the room goes on the wall in 2 minutes on the sticky note. And we talk about the ideas for what would an ideal call look like. So you've kind of created that cognitive dissonance. Bad example, let's do a good example. All the time the learner is being asked to participate, to contribute, to analyze, to talk. They can't switch off, they can't lean back in the chair, they can't doodle on a pad. They've too much engagement to be involved in. So that's just a couple of slides from a simple piece. This, as I say, is for the guys who answer the phones. If you like, anyone who's ever spent time in a call center, you'll know that they're very large kind of cube farms. That's a bit of an unfair term maybe, but everybody's got a desk and a cubicle. This training was for those guys. I mention that because I'm going to show you another piece of training in a few minutes for a different group in the same business. So that's just an example of one piece of classroom training we did and how we kind of build in lots of activities. Here you can see a teamwork activity. People are broken into 3s and 4s and told they're going to compete with each other, come up with better ideas. That's always a fun thing to do. And then so on and so forth. So that's just an example of that. So let's go back to my main slide deck. So section 2, I talked about aligning the brand. Now, let me just get that up on the full screen. So what do I mean by aligning the brand? Well, Working with brands, you saw earlier on in one of the early slides, we work with a variety of different clients. They've all got different industries, different products, different business needs, different challenges, and very different workforces. We place a very high premium on aligning any training materials quite closely to the client's brand. Now, the obvious side of that is, here's our brand guidelines. These are our fonts. This is our hero color. We use these kind of pictures, not that kind of pictures. We don't show people in ties. We do show people in ties, and so on and so forth. That's really only half the battle. When I talk about aligning to the brand, I'm actually much more thinking about aligning to the voice. And what I mean by that is that every company we work with, their learners will have a different voice. The company will have a different corporate voice. And I don't mean the corporate voice that you get in annual reports. So what I mean is, we work with the client, we ask immediately, do you have a YouTube channel? Do you have a Twitter feed? We want to look at any social media, because that can often give an indication of the true voice of the client, the true voice of the customers. So in the example we were just looking at there for Sitel, this is, I talked about, you know, high churn, high attrition. The call agents tend to be younger folks, not exclusively. You can also get some boomers coming back to the workforce, or perhaps folks in their 40s or 50s who thought they wanted maybe a change in career. On the whole, though, it's largely a millennial audience. So you can see that it's quite bright, it's quite colorful. It's also really simple. If you're thinking to yourself, there's not a lot of text on those slides, that's exactly correct. We wanted to keep it minimal, short, punchy, and super engaged. We didn't want any language in there or vocabulary that kind of sounded like HR. Similarly, we didn't want any language or vocabulary that sounds like instructional design. You know, we don't want it to sound like guys like me who excessively talk about learning outcomes and learning objectives. We've tried to use a very friendly, approachable, even in places slightly arch or witty tone, something that kind of grabs your attention and really kind of speaks to that audience. So I might show you another piece of training from another client who has an audience in their 40s who likely have MBAs. Maybe it's detailed financial training, and you'll see a radically different tone and voice in the copy, and you'll see a radically different visual tone in the visuals for that audience. So we align each project and all deliverables to the brand and the voice of that client, not just in the service of satisfying the audience, but also in the service of making that new learner buy into the brand and the values of that company that they've just joined. Because oftentimes a lot of our classroom training might be new hire training, onboarding training, whether it be call centers or financial giants. Onboarding training, a lot of it is about aligning your new hire staff to the values of the organization in which you joined, and trying to get across that sense of the new hire, we've got you, we've got your back, you've joined a smart company, we've got it all worked out for you, we're on it. Trying to give a real sense of confidence to that learner in the first days, because as we all know, first few days in a job, they're nerve-wracking, but also we know that the attrition rate, there's a direct effect or direct link between attrition rate and bad onboarding experiences. So if you can make a learner feel this is a clever company with a good brand, and they're kind of with it, they're on it, that'll go a long way to helping people retain their staff. So that's enough about aligning the brand. On to the really interesting bit for me, I think, which is about applying it to the job. So again, I think I've said it 3 times now, learning isn't an event, it's a process. It doesn't stop at the classroom door. It doesn't stop at the end of the e-learning course. What makes learning really stick, what makes it really successful, is when we can extend the classroom. And that's a really, really crucial idea. A key tool we have used in achieving that is a thing called the Interactive Media Workbook. That is essentially a PDF with interactive elements. So you have videos embedded in it, audio you can listen to. Hey, listen to this expert interview with this guy. He says 3 things. Watch this video of this scenario. Watch this video of a clip from a movie, which illustrates a theme we're trying to get across to you. PDF is great for class-based training, but what really makes it sing is when you say to a learner, you're coming to, I don't know, let's say a 3-hour class in the classroom. Here's a workbook. You've got an hour's worth of activities to perform before you come to the classroom. You're going to use this workbook in the classroom to complete activities, and then you're going to do something after the classroom. So the workbook becomes the red thread that pulls it all together. Why is this good? If there are any classroom facilitators on today's call, I'm sure you've had the experience of you rock up, it's Monday, you're psyched, it's your training, you've got everything ready, and you walk into a classroom full of guys or girls and they don't know why they're there, or they've only a vague notion of why they're there. They haven't been given any preparation. If you ask the learner to do a preparation activity before they come in the door, it just makes the whole thing get off the ground so much faster. It makes everybody much more engaged. We then ask the learners to perform the kind of activities I showed you a few minutes ago, lots of discussion, and maybe some of those activities are in the service of you completing a checklist in your workbook, a checklist which becomes a tool for you to bring back to the workplace. And then crucially, and in the third part, as I say, we want to extend it beyond the end of the classroom door and get it into the workplace. So some examples of that are, we can build in team activities. Okay, you're done with the class, go meet your local leader, manager, buddy. You guys have got a group activity. It's always nicer to do activities after a class in the group, if particularly if you're new to a company and it's onboarding training. It can help solidify a cohort or a network of people. For many of our clients, one of the most important things in the onboarding is build your network. People who build networks at this company thrive, people who don't die. That's something we hear quite a lot. So team activities are great for that. Personal activities can also be really powerful, specifically for particular roles of work. So these are activities related to my sales job, to my marketing job, to my programming job. Manager check-ins are beyond important. Why? Gives the learner skin in the game, gives the manager oversight of the learning happening, and crucially, everybody is accountable. So oftentimes you'll hear us at Interactive Services refer to this as the accountability principle, that what breaks our heart is when we design a brilliant piece of training and there's a kind of fire and forget element. Go to your classroom training and nobody ever talks to you about it ever again. We need to really challenge that and say something like, you've done your training, a week from now you're going to sit down with your manager, informal, cup of coffee kind of chat, bring this workbook from the classroom and show him or her what you've done, and then have a discussion with that manager around any questions or clarifications you need. That has a dramatic effect on the way in which the learning sticks and transferring it from the classroom to the job. So let's take another example, look at what that looks like. So let's drill down a bit. So earlier on, I showed you the training for the guys and girls who answer the phones. This is a training package and some screenshots from an interactive PDF for the guys and girls who support those people answering the phones. So if you've ever been in a call center, you got like 9, 12 guys in their cubes answering phones and their headsets. There'll be one guy or girl who walks the floor around them. I call them the 4-star generals. They're there to support people. If somebody gets in trouble, they can jack into a call, they can offer support and solutions. They're crucial to the running of call centers, and they're crucial to the success of keeping new staff. Vital. So this is an interactive workbook that covers a 6 to 9 month period for people who've just been promoted into that job, and it embodies all of the principles we've just been talking about. It incorporates classroom training, study work before the classroom training, self-study work on your own, and then check-ins with leaders or managers. Broken into phases. Phase 1 is learning, phase 1 app is application. Those are your homework activities. Show you just a couple of slides from that, or pages from that. You can see down the right-hand side here, there are tabs. If this were the real thing, I'd click on a tab, it jumps me down to phase 2. You can easily move around this interactive PDF. So here we've explained to the learner, these are your workbook activities. You're required to do activities. Here's the kind of activities you're going to be doing. We then say to them, there's a simple instructional design model. Again, we want to make that back to that simple visual framework of ideas they can quickly grab. You're going to learn stuff. You're going to practice it, you're going to prove that you know how to do it, and then you're going to make a plan for on the job. Really, really simple stuff. And then perhaps most importantly, we also say to this particular learner, to be successful in this job, you need to be able to do 4 things. You need to be the coach, grow the business, lead to engage, and act with insight. Now, those are very simple icons of very complex ideas. What I would encourage everybody here today is that if you're designing a piece of classroom training for either yourself or another client, oftentimes you'll find that your clients have a stated set of corporate values. They're oftentimes reduced down to 3, 4, or 5 simple values or badges. There's frameworks or structures. Find out what they are, because oftentimes you'll find that those 4 or 5 stated values actually accurately summarize the skills that somebody really needs to succeed in a job. So back to this thing of tell them why they care, tell them why it's useful, frame it up as a simple set of toolbox ideas, and explain, if you do these 4 things and follow all these activities, you'll be really good at your job and you'll save yourself a whole load of time later on. So what does that look like activity to activity? Here's an example. Well done. You've made it to the end of this day 1 self-study. You're going to go to a classroom session. Before you do, we need you to do these 4 activities. Up in the top left, you can see that this is a Planet activity. I do it in my workbook, and it's in service of that skill, act with insight. So the whole idea is all the time, anytime you're ever asking a learner to do anything in a classroom or on their own connected to a classroom, always remind them why they're doing it. You're doing this because it's in service of you getting good at this part of your job or that part of your job. Really, really important. All the time we talk about WIIFM, WIFM, what's in it for me. So there's an example of one. Here's a sort of interactive activity inside the workbook. Again, this one could be done on your own or could be done in the classroom with facilitator support. Earlier on, I made a little bit of a joke about the word interactive. We hear this all the time. Make it interactive, make it interactive. Making things interactive doesn't mean just clicking things. I can have a learner click things all day long. Doesn't mean they're going to learn anything. It isn't interactive if it doesn't actually engage the brain. So all the times our activities, be they self-study, be they classroom, be they in a group, should be in service of making you shove something from short-term memory to long-term memory by means of an activity. So it's got to be a meaningful interactivity. If you're filling your classes or your e-learning courses or whatever kind of training with meaningless interactions, that will annoy the learner more than just sitting there and talking at them. Let's take another one. Here's one of the check-ins I talked about, the skin in the game, accountability kind of exercises. So in this instance, it's called leader to leader. So it's like, well done, you've got to the end of phase 1, which will be about a month's work of work, classes, self-study, workbook activities. Sit down with your leader, check each box, discussion points here. The leader, by the way, has another version of this workbook, a much thinner, slimmer version, which says, your guy's going to come to you having done this. We're going to have this conversation. Here are 4 or 5 helpful questions you can ask during that session. These are the kind of things you're likely to be asked about. Make sure they've done the activities and make it informal and support them. So again, all the time, connecting self-study or pre-classroom work to classroom work to on-the-job work. Extend that classroom out, apply it to the job. So let's have a quick summary. So first, make it interactive. The 80-20 rule. Participants should learn from each other. Lecture should be used sparingly. Discussion and team activity maximized. Participants kept on their toes. Regular interaction and activity. Some people have asked me, do you actually get to that number? Do you actually get 80% learner, 20% facilitator? Candidly, not all the time. Sometimes it's 60-40, 70-30, but you know what? Even if it's only 50-50, that's a dramatic realignment of the classroom, and I think you'll have a much happier set of learners. Align it to the brand, align to the visuals and the voice. Tap into the learners group so that you feel like you're giving them support, guidance, and structure in a way that builds confidence in that client's brand. And then last but by no means least, apply it on the job, extend the classroom. We've said a bunch of times now, learning isn't an event, it's a process. So make those classroom materials something that are useful on the job. Give people skin in the game and the tools to succeed. So that's the end of a quick kind of blast. I've just gone 31 minutes, so that's pretty good. What I'll do now is I'll throw the microphone open in a virtual sense to Neil, and maybe we can take some questions from the audience if anybody has any. Neil, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Damien. That was great stuff and much appreciated. We have had 2 questions in so far, and for anyone on the line, if you do have additional questions that you want to send through, just pop them into the question box and I'll be able to pick them up and pass them to Damien. So the other one was from Catherine, who was referencing the interactive media workbook PDF document and asking if you're asking learners to maybe jump in and out of that document or go to an external resource, how do you make sure that people actually go back into that document and complete the activities?
Yeah, excellent question. So yeah, really good question. So if you recall that whole thing of the leader to leader or manager meeting that takes place after the classroom, that's the silver bullet. Now, why is that so important? An interactive PDF does pretty much everything that an e-learning course does, except one thing. It doesn't score. It can't tell you if you've got a question right or wrong. It does play videos, it does play audio. You can type into it. You can do a bunch of really cool things with it. You can build up an action plan in the bottom of the document. You know, it's really, really cool, the stuff it does, but it's not a SCO, so it doesn't sit on an LMS and it doesn't track or score. So if there is a need in your training for some form of assessment or validation, I think might be a better word, build in that manager checkpoint. That way the learner thinks, oh yeah, someone's going to check on me here. I've got skin in the game. I'm going to pay attention to this. So that psychological nudge of knowing I'm going to sit down and talk about this in a week from now is incredibly important. Another little footnote, not to get too tactical, interactive workbooks, I said they don't track and score, but they do one thing that e-learning courses don't. And that is you can type into them. You can type extensive notes to yourself and save them, and it sits on your desktop or your tablet or your device, and it's there as a living, breathing thing. That's why we kind of take this approach to the extended periods of learning, like curriculums. You know, give them a workbook. It's a working, living thing which they can go back to for years afterwards. E-learning courses do all that tracking and scoring stuff, but you can't type into them for reasons too boring to go into about the way browsers and cookies work. So to go back to the original question, you need to build in that accountability principle and build in some kind of after the event meeting. Neil, any other questions or thoughts from anybody?
Yeah, one final one from Gail, again, tying into the interactive media book question. What is the level of effort involved in creating one of those?
I'm going to presume that Gail means for interactive services rather than for someone like Gail. But so it's around about, in terms of pure time, it's around about the same amount of production time as you might see for an e-learning course. In some ways, it's a little bit easier. It doesn't need to be whacked with a hammer quite as much as an e-learning course does. Like, you know, if it's an HTML e-learning course, needs to be tested on various devices. An interactive PDF needs to be tested on maybe one or two. But the production schedule is roughly the same. So we go through the same phases we would go through for an e-learning course. We'll have a design workshop with you, from which we generate a design document, from which we generate a bunch of prototype slides for the classroom and the facilitator guide. And it's not wildly dissimilar from the production of any other training deliverable, like an e-learning course or anything like that. Okay, so Neil, are there any other questions?
No, that's everything. Thanks so much, Damien.
Okay. Well, just to say finally, folks, as I say, please, if you're unfamiliar with this, do drop by interactiveservices.com and have a rummage around. There's loads of great stuff in there. Anybody's particularly curious or really bored, you can find out more about me many of my colleagues on LinkedIn and indeed on Twitter. And I want to finally say thank you all for attending today. I hope you found the session useful. If anybody's any questions about anything at all, please feel free to reach out to us. And we look forward to talking to you in the future.